Well, welcome, Paul, and welcome to everybody who will be seeing this this vlog with Paul. And just to introduce myself, I'm Martyn Higgins. I'm an associate editor of British Journal of Social Work. And just to explain to people who obviously aren't here at the moment, but hopefully at a future time will be watching this. This is part of the British Journal of Social Work's widening use of social media and open up a wider openness and availability of authors publishing our journal. And so we've started a series of blogs and other types of social material as well. And what we also run is editor's choice. And what that means is well, no, obviously this was me, the editor at the time chooses an author who in that edition, particularly in the editors who stood out. And maybe I can explain to Paul why I chose and asked Paul to come along. I think for me, particularly in the particular paper that of Paul's he's going to talk about, in a way it seems to be going back, obviously Paul might think otherwise, to the original question, or maybe always eternal question, what is social work all about? And also personally, because I'm a great admirer of Paul's work, so personal reasons, but also I think it's actually come at a very helpful, complex time, but also a time where maybe there are other ways of thinking and moving forward with social work. And Paul, I'll just say some stuff for people who obviously may find more information about you. You're Professor NUI Galway in the Republic of Ireland, and you're one of the leading international social work editors throughout the world. And I won't praise you too much more than that. So in terms of the paper, it was published up, just so people know, it's published, it's a 51-4. And briefly, in the sense, it's a kind of, you're doing a response to another paper, but I wondered if you wanted to talk a bit about the paper. And also for me, I think, and obviously maybe not for our automates, why have you written it now? I thought that was kind of linked to. So over to you about why this paper, why now?
Okay, thank you, Martyn, and thanks for inviting me to have this the brief conversation. And I suppose more than that, thanks to everyone carrying on this work with the British Journal of Social Work in difficult times. Yourselves as kind of editors and admin work as proofreaders. I mean, it's tremendous effort to to maintain a journal in these times. I suppose the other thing, just by way of preamble, despite what the blurb says on my book, Dissenting Social Work, I'm not a professor of social work here at NUI.
I've insulted you there.
Yeah, I'm a more kind of humble kind of foot soldier. Anyway, I suppose in brief terms, Chris's paper appeared, and just around the time I'd finished, submitted the manuscript for Dissenting. So, it was kind of timely in that sense. So perhaps why I wrote the book first, because that provided something of a platform for my response to Chris. I guess I was interested in the conjuncture in which we found ourselves. And I mean, in the book, I talk about the conjuncture as being made up of a number of elements. I guess foundationally, neoliberal capitalism continually crashing through the barriers and essentially ensuring that we had a pre-existing condition when COVID hit. So I say a little bit about the conjuncture, also embracing global warming, issues to do with migration, issues to do with the rise of the populist right and neo-fascism. So I tried as best I was able to try and encompass those large themes, and then to look at the field of social work in the context of that. So as I say, I just submitted the manuscript when Chris's piece was published, and I enjoyed Chris's piece, and I was glad the journal accepted it. I think it is I guess a provocation, essentially, but a timely provocation. He addresses, in some senses, some of the same themes that interested me. However, I found myself arriving at a very different conclusion than Chris, on account of this call to end social work, which, I mean, in some senses is kind of nonsensical anyway. I mentioned elsewhere, there's this comment by the Marxist literary critic Frederick Jameson, and he says it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And in some senses, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of social work. Social work is not going to go away. So it's, what do we do within the field if we want to pursue, as best we're able to, kind of progressive dissenting agendas? So that's what I kind of run with in the article. And I guess what I do, and should you wish me to, Martyn, I could say more about this. I have particular difficulties with aspects of Chris's analysis. Yet at the same time, I endeavour to be kind of respectful of the significant messages that it conveys as well.
Do you want to expand a bit about your paper? Because obviously that's the heart of what we're talking about. Your paper. Because obviously, I guess the criticisms of Media, but also they also link, because you talk a bit about your own, dissenting social work in the way that's and so on.
Yeah. I guess to perhaps roll it back just a little way. I suppose I start off in the paper by just raising issues around kind of the timing. We don't have any reflection on the fact that, social workers in undertaking the work day out are putting their health and safety at risk. And I think arguably a somewhat kind of strident tone kind of lost that aspect. And just to say, of course, I'm mindful of the fact that, I'm no longer practicing social work. In some senses, this is a view from the outside, from within the academy. I stopped being a social worker in 99, not knocked on strangers' doors since that. So I think that's kind of important. I say that because I think there were issues around positionality. I think there's a lacuna as well in terms of, if we're talking about abolishing social work, we're also talking about abolishing the jobs of largely women workers, because it's such a profession, and all that was kind of occluded. I think also there were issues around Chris's uses of evidence. The notion that social work constitutes a threat to people, and he draws on the work of Staniforth and her colleagues. And if one reads that research, it's much more kind of nuanced, and that is not what users of services are actually saying. So I think it often pays to have regard to the literature in perhaps a more forensic way, than was done in the article. I also suggest, and I entirely realised that this was not the intention of Chris, that it was actually providing some ammunition for the neoliberal right, who bore public sector social work. I guess then I moved on to look at what I call the rap sheet, the case that is made for the abolition of social work. And essentially, that's made up of 4 elements. And I think in one of the most powerful aspects of the article, the first element, Chris talks about social work as collusion in terms of historical abusive practices. And I think it's a section of the article that, you know, all educators, social work students should read. It's a very powerful, concise piece. He then talks about theoretical tensions and almost hankers for some kind of unitary theoretical perspective. And I suggest that there are dangers in that, because diversity provides the analytical and practical space for some of us to launch kind of more critical dissenting approaches. He talks about professional problems, and I think there he's at great risk of conflating neoliberal professionalism with other types of professionalism. And there I try to draw on the work of Bourdieu and Martyn, and their distinction between apparatus and field. And he talks also, the 4th element is the failure to rise contemporary challenges, where again, I think Chris makes a number of substantial points, but I think how he suggests we resolve these difficulties is kind of wide of the mark, because he ends up suggesting, as we know, that the profession should simply end. And there, leaving aside the points I've already made, I think there's 2 focal problems. And the first of these, there's an intellectual, a lack of intellectual curiosity, perhaps, about why social workers are on occasions compliant when anything about their code of ethics suggests that they should be resistant and dissenting. And I draw on some work which, you know, suggests why that might be the case as well, make some of my own points. The second major flaw, as I see it, is the beyond social work is not theorized. It's a little vacuous. Beyond social work, which seems to be some kind of pristine zone populated by kind of zealots, imbued with unbounded grace. And it's almost got a kind of evangelical tinge. So I try to make the point that there's really no outside of neoliberalism. All spheres, all fields are saturated with neoliberal imperatives. So the question then becomes, at least for me, is how do we struggle? How do we dissent? How do we resist? How do we forge chains of solidarity in the fields in which we find ourselves? And that kind of then pushes me toward, you know, this notion that I refer to as dissenting social work.
I suppose a point you said about what I struggled a bit with later was what was he about? What was he why is he writing this now? That's what I struggled. You know what I mean? Why are you right? What the whyness of it? I struggled. Really. He writes well. It's kind of engaging, but and also that bit about what he said. Why now? Given what's going on, you know, why this paper now? I did struggle.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a helicopter just flying by. There we go. Yeah, I think that was one of the difficulties, because, as I mentioned earlier, arguably there's a failure to engage with the conjuncture. You know, we don't find anything in relation to the dreadful COVID pandemic, although the piece was published maybe 10 months into the pandemic. we find little about, you know, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, you know, a range of other issues. So I think it's a good point, Martyn, that arguably Chris doesn't really situate his discussion in the times in which we find ourselves. And I guess because of the times with which, you know, in which we find ourselves, some of the issues that he does raise, though, have a fresh urgency. I think despite pointing to what perceived as the deficits in Chris's argument, I think he performs a significant kind of service. You know, the piece is kind of polemical, but sometimes we need polemics like that to trigger our thinking and our activism.
He also, I think, you also talk about Mailer being a flamethrower.
Yeah.
I wonder, can you explain what you mean by he's a flame? I think it's a flamethrower social work.
Yeah.
It's a nice metaphor, I thought.
Yeah. I mean, I think, firstly, the metaphor is very playful.
Yeah.
So just to be clear, a couple of years ago, Chris was in Galway, and he went out of his way to meet me. We went for coffee here, you know, we had like a little chat. And, you know, one of the things that struck me, he has this beautiful beard. Yeah. Very full beard. So I kind of played with this silly idea, well, you know, this man's at risk of setting that beard on fire. I mean, the other things going on with the flamethrower metaphor, of course, is he's in social work. To launch an attack against social work, and arguably a little silly, you know, he does risk singeing his own bed. The other thing going on with the metaphor, though, would be the attack was, you know, a flamethrower is not terribly honed unless you're a competent user of flamethrower. The flame was dispersed somewhat indiscriminately, and so it lacked focus. So, I mean, one of the things I say quite early on in my piece is we hear nothing, for example, about social work in China. Talks about the Anglophone world, and China is soon going to have more social workers than anywhere else. So in that sense, I think if we're to embark on a more kind of useful interrogation of what's going on in social work, we have to dwell on what's going on within specific fields, within specific jurisdictions, because we can't, we can, but with some difficulty, talk about social work per se. There are a number of different social works, aren't there? You know, so that was what was going on, I guess, with the flamethrower metaphor.
Yeah. I suppose it does reflect that. What the way criticism of his work, really, there is a kind of a playfulness, I guess, but perhaps not the playfulness that is the right time for it, because obviously playfulness can be a critical tool.
Yeah,
a successful one. But
I think, yeah, again, perhaps there was a difficulty with the tonality of the piece.
Yeah.
But again, to recognise what he was doing and what I was trying to do in some senses is we was trying to write something that was kind of accessible, you know, that was, well, talking about my own piece, that was informed by research, that was informed by abstract theorization, but was an accessible enough read for people, you know.
I mean, I was interested in what you said just now as well, that you said, because I did wonder at one point in your paper whether you were making the assumption that there is a social work. I think actually now you've talked about social works, which I think fits always with your own theoretical background, because the stage we're managing to see there isn't. There's many social.
Yeah, that's the case, that it kind of, I guess, varies across time, varies across space. And I suppose just to add, Martyn, as well, one of the things I neglected to mention at the outset that prompted the book, and I begin with reference to this, is specifically what's been going on with social work in Ireland.
Mm.
And here, the regulatory body called, it's an unelected quango, appointed by the government, but it's seen fit to remove any reference to human rights from the social work code of ethics. A crucial occurrence, so that again kind of prompted me to think, well, how can we organize against these moves to kind of nullify the more progressive aspects of the profession, so I guess it was a lot of things coming together at the same time that the article.
Actually, I also wondered, talking about, actually, what you do talk about with dissenting social work, probably links to what you said just now, is that the dissenting social work provides a range of possibilities. So I wonder if you could expand on what I mean, sort of bit what we just touched already, but what do you mean by DSW providing a range of possibilities?
Yeah, I guess one of the things I try to do, not so much in the article, but more in the book, is I try to unpack dissent, and I try to convey the idea that I'm not kind of valorizing or fetishizing dissent, because of course we can have dissent from the right. Yeah. So I'm suggesting dissenting social work, if it's dissenting, has to be more aligned with the aspects of the definition of the profession, particularly around notions of human liberation and social justice. So what I try to suggest is that, social work, or at least significant sections of it, and I try to make this clear, I'm not arguing naively that the entire profession everywhere can be to these ideas. Should become more attuned to kind of movements which are presently resisting neoliberal capitalism and the racialized and gendered orders that it gives rise to, which is kind of a rather grand phrase, but I'm suggesting in doing so, there's a need to create kind of structures within structures. There's a need for more progressive educators, practitioners, service users to kind of come together to kind of collectively organize opposition to neoliberal imperatives. I mean, we've seen that done in some senses in relation to SWAN, the social work network in various places. And along with, what goes on in trade unions and in social movements, I'm suggesting these are tremendously important in the times in which we find ourselves. Because if we don't do that, then the profession, and this is the thing that Chris kind of signals, profession risks being kind of hollowed out. No. And it is a danger, but there's lots of possibilities as well. And what I do in the book, as well as suggesting how we might ally ourselves with a number of kind of social movements and so on, I have regard to a number of kind of thinkers who may be helpful in that sense, in a theoretical way. So perhaps unsurprisingly, I talk about Marx, I talk about Rancière, talk about Shoshana Zuboff, who's not a theorist as such, but she's interesting things to say in relation to surveillance capitalism. I draw on the work of Anna Arendt in a more critical way. Similarly, I'm very critical of Levinas. But these thinkers who could prompt us to think in more oppositional ways. And I think one of the things I'm conscious of there is in a recent piece that you wrote, Martyn, you draw attention to the dangers of automatic thinking. Hannah Arendt similarly draws our attention to thoughtlessness. As Fanon is preoccupied by similar concerns. So it's how, as a kind of professional field, can we combat dull compliance, thoughtlessness, automatic thinking, call it what you will, by imbuing our thinking and our actions with more kind of critical theorization, if you will. So in some senses, the book is just kind of a modest attempt to do that, do you know?
I puzzled a bit about the book, because if you actually, interesting that I was thinking particularly about Levinas and Arendt when you say that. I think, and particularly with Arendt, actually, I thought it was a kind of interesting dialogue, something about you in that dialogue, because in a way because Levinas and Arendt definitely don't, I think, fit into your, they're never quite fitted into social work. They never really have. Although, like you said, there's a bit more around. And I wondered why engage with them when, in a sense, I speak because I know I know a bit about Levinas, but I know more about Arendt, although I'm not an expert on either of those. I couldn't see how Arendt would ever fit. Well, she has that way of thinking, but unlike obviously things like with Israel and so on, and she was always, I think, a bit, I don't know, never quite fitted into, in a good way, I guess that is. But I couldn't quite see why you engaged with her. Although, given I thought actually when you came to the end of the chat, you sort of said, "Oh well," sort of like, "Well, no." That's always, and I thought, why talk to her? Why engage with her? Because I thought when you mentioned, I thought, Paul won't agree with her, and yet you and you obviously seem to have real interest in her, having said all that.
Yeah,
and I thought about that, and I thought, oh,
yeah. No, again, Martyn, I think a very good point you raised, because I think there are a couple of chapters in the book, Arendt and Levinas, that in some senses don't fit. Okay. Now, why don't they fit? I think because in broad terms, the other writers featured, I think we have much more to gain from immersing ourselves in them. And I'd be, in broad terms, kind of politically attuned to what they're trying to do. And I'd be attuned to how they might help us. Whereas not so much with Arendt, and certainly not with Levinas. However, I wanted to engage with them because if we take Arendt, for example, certainly during the Trump era, there was a resurgence of attention given to her. I remember even like the Guardian in Britain had the front of G2, for example, had her photo and so on. And there's a piece written in the Journal of Social Work by Joe Smeaton arguing, that social work had as much to gain from Arendt. So I was interested in kind of engaging with her. I describe her in the chapter as a contrarian. She's a conservative thinker, but
why do you think she's conservative?
She's conservative. I think one aspect that I think there's great difficulties with Arendt is, one, I don't really dwell on this so much in the book, but I think she's a deeply racialized thinker. For example, some of her comments during the rise of the civil rights movement are deeply problematic. She wrote this infamous article in relation to the events of Little Rock, when there's an attempt to desegregate schooling. So highly problematic. But underpinning her kind of perceptions, there's a kind of fear of the mob, if you will, of the plebeians, and I think that's embodied with her kind of critique of we risk perhaps going into too much detail here, but a critique of what she calls the social. I would argue that actually social work is part of what she would critique as the social, right? But an interesting thinker, some of the, the book she wrote on Eichmann, for example, the Eichmann trial, we need to read it because it alerts us to the danger of docility and compliance. Moving on to Levinas, why did I want to engage with Levinas? Because Levinas is immensely problematic because he's so Eurocentric and indeed racist thinker. And again, there's been suggestions that he should be more central within the theorization of social work. And those who've argued that don't address the racism, the Eurocentrism, the xenophobia of Levinas. And one of the reasons I wanted to get into that, because that allowed me then to say a little bit in relation to Palestine. Because, again, that's often within the discourse of social work. It's kind of, it's secluded. I think it's kind of vital that, basically put progressive educators, if you will, engage with what's taking place in Palestine. In doing that, it's recognizing the work undertaken by Palestinian social workers and indeed by critics of the Israeli state within the Israeli left. But yeah, I do agree in terms of there's a tension there in terms of the inclusion of Arendt and Levinas, but I think the decision to include them, I mean, we'll see what reviewers think, but I think they fit with the general perspective that I try to evolve in the.
I wonder if it would you say it could be a change in your thinking? Is there obviously your thoughts better than obviously I could have known, but it felt, the book itself, and the paper actually felt, seems to be and I do not know what I mean by this, a kind of change in your thinking. The paper I thought was about it. I thought the paper in a way seemed to be looking at social work. But when I've read your work, it seems to be a slightly different way of approaching social work than previously, and also with the book as well. I felt it, and I think in the book mentioning Levinas and Arendt, I thought was a kind of departure, but I'm not sure what I mean by that, and I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But I think, and again, I say the paper as well, kind of change, but I don't know what I mean by that. It's just that it felt different, if that can make sense. It felt kind of different.
Yeah. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, just maybe two things going on. Again, perhaps arguably, it's the most, some would dispute this, but I think it's perhaps the most Marxist book. The second thing that's going on with this, with the book, is in writing it, I was much more conscious of the deficiencies in some of the things I've written previously in relation to questions of race and in relation to questions of Eurocentrism. I mean, oddly enough, I have actually written, I was thinking the other day, I've written quite a bit in relation to issues of race. In relation to, for example, Irish in Britain, but also in relation to questions of race in terms of the Victoria Columbier tragedy, and in terms of issues of the treatment of asylum seekers and so on in Ireland. But I think that where is this most marked in the book? It's probably my engagement with Frantz Fanon, who I didn't really begin to read until maybe a couple of years ago. And I think Fanon's work is tremendously helpful, not only in terms of how we think around or about big themes to do with colonialism and neocolonialism, but he's, he was a practicing psychiatrist. I mean, he was in a kindred field, and some of the things that he has to say about those issues, again, I think are kind of vital. And I think particularly if one reads Fanon's work, and indeed kind of journals, contributions to journals, when he was practicing as a psychiatrist, you get the sense that this was someone who was constantly reflecting, constantly learning, constantly evolving his perceptions. And I think that conveys something significant for us as a profession as well. But
is he much written about in social work? I mean, I'm not saying I've never heard of him, but I didn't know really anything about him until I read your book.
Yeah, I suppose that was one of the things I was trying to do with the book also, with Arendt, with Levinas, with Fanon, with Shoshana Zuboff, to put into the field the authors who were not that familiar. In terms of Fanon himself, I think, again, Martyn, I think you're right. There's been very little written. There was a piece fairly recently in Critical and Radical Social Work from John Wainwright and a colleague. And there may have been another piece in that same issue. But again, particularly in the context of Black Lives Matters and so on. It's Fanon does, it's worthwhile engaging with. I think,
Now I'm not sure if you like, but I always wonder whether you're really a grand theorist, and I thought you might find it not a bit. But I always think that in some sense you are a grand theorist, maybe a sort of different sort. But I always think in some way you. I don't know what your view of that.
Yeah, I suppose I could maybe think about it different ways. I mean, one of the things, I think it's vital to regard to the kind of the big abstract theoretical paradigms, and to read Marx, Gramsci, and so on. But I don't think I engage with these writers in a way which simply has them kind of hovering above practice, if you will. So, and I suppose there's just a couple of things going on there. I mean, one of the things is, I didn't become an academic, and I use that word sensitively because I know of Wacquan's critique of until I was 40. I never had anything published till I was 40. I've been a social worker for a number of years. I've been unemployed. I've been working in kind of homelessness fields. I was kind of rooted in practice experience, not to the same extent now, of course, but that continues. That practitioner lens continues to form what I think about and what I do. I think some of the abstract stuff is tremendously helpful in terms of aiding our thinking about particular questions within social work. So, when I was a social worker, many of the time there'd be referrals, I'd be working in child protection, and we'd go out and inquire about instances where children have been left so-called home alone, if you will. And not infrequently, these issues were related to women, single parents, working class women, trying to make ends meet, you know, trying to balance, achieve an impossible balance between nurturing the children on their own, generating an income. I think if one reads Marx, if one reads some of the feminists who've done work around social reproduction theory, building on a Marxist analysis and addressing the gaps, that kind of enables us to get a better sense of what was going on in those houses that led to those children being alone. Those women were in kind of lose-lose situations. That was to do with issues to do with gender, to do with how a capitalist society works. And it's kind of important that social workers draw on this type of theorization, and so they know what is actually taking place in those micro situations. In terms of the theory as well, I mean, what I try to do is in classes with students, you know, we look to relate theory to what's gone on placements and so on, and to look at the gaps in theory. And I think one of the things that I try to be sensitive to is, you know, what the students bring. Yeah. We've had a number of students who've, you know, been asylum seekers, experience kind of direct, what we call here direct provision. Yeah. We have students, and I guess it's the same for your place, you know, they're trying to make ends meet, perhaps doing the course, working in bars, hospitality, COVID, working in social care. So in some senses, their contributions to discussion, they kind of replenish and identify the gaps that are available in these big paradigms, because many of them are on, you know, the sharp end of the most pernicious practices of the state and of, you know, immigration policing and so on. You know, so this grand theory can be handled in a way which, again, is useful and can illuminate questions which are attached to their maybe lived experiences and indeed our own lived experiences.
This again, this sort of last written question I've got is, and I got it really when I was reading your article. It was about, I just wondered, and it links also to your response to Melius, whether, are you optimistic about social work?
Yeah, I'm always slightly, not to disparage the question, but I'm always slightly wary of that word optimism, because it seemed, I've probably been reading too much around kind of positive psychology and so on. You know, it's resilience. It seems a little, arguably a little kind of light, a little airy. I suppose what I'd say is I would be kind of hopeful. I'd be hopeful.
Yeah.
Not to be too clever as well. I'd probably be lacking in hope at the same time. Dialectic going on. I mean, one of the things that we're clear about is that, you know, the difficulties that we face politically, socially, within the field of social work, capital can't resolve. You know, the contradictions that capital generates can be solved within capitalism. We need a new system. So in that sense, and if one looks around, you know, the resistances that's been generated over the past number of years, I would be hopeful as well. Importantly, and I try to convey this in the book and perhaps to a lesser extent in the article, that this entails a program of hard work as well. It needs us to try and build structures within structures, organizing mechanisms to enable us to pursue more progressive agendas. one can pursue, you know, intellectual projects like writing articles for journals, and so on, which may have some significance, but we need to think about other ways of kind of, I guess, combating the powers that be as best we're able to as well. Networking, you know, forging rainbow coalitions and so on. So, yeah.
I think maybe that is a better word, because I think a number of people whose names I must get on there talk about social work is the hopeful profession, isn't it? But in a way, to be a social worker, even if things aren't going well, aren't looking good, maybe optimistic is not the word, but maybe always already in some kind of fundamental sense. But to do social work in some sense, you have to be hopeful.
Yeah. Again, though, Martyn, I suppose what I would say is one of the aspects of Chris's piece, which is kind of laudable, is he does demolish this idea that, you know, social work is comprised of a profession, angels, if you will. I mean, I talk in the about an angel's discourse, which he kind of demolishes. So, you know, social work has also been compliant with a lot of tremendously oppressive kind of regimes and so on. So it's a field in which struggle will take place. You know, not a progressive entity, profession, field, call it what in and of itself. How we shape and mold that field.
And in your, I think it's in your book actually. I'm not sure you list a number of I think it's in your book actually about how dissenting social work could move forward. Is it in your, I think it's in your.
It is. Yeah. I was talking to someone the other day who, perhaps not unreasonably, said, "Well, this is just a shopping list." Do you know? And that's the criticism it's vulnerable to. Yeah. I mean, these are. I mean, I describe them as, you know, this is not about a blueprint or an action plan. These are some of the key kind of themes or coordinates that we perhaps should be kind of foregrounding as we begin to think about, well, how can a more progressive, left-orientated profession or segment within the profession emerge out of what will, you know, hopefully be the end of the pandemic. And I suppose I have to be kind of careful saying that as well, because I mean, if we have regard whatever happens in the global north, I mean, what is going on in the global south is going to be entirely disastrous for a number of years.
That's really helpfully answered my questions. Did you want to expand on anything?
Not especially. I mean, one of the things which I think is kind of nice, I'm going to understand from Vasilius and Rhea, as well as the co-editors like yourself, Martyn, is that the article that Chris wrote, my response is kind of generating feedback and so on. And you know, that's always good, because it's important that we have these debates. If nothing else, you know, if the two articles are contributing to a kind of vibrant debate, I think, you know, they perhaps perform something of a service. In terms of the book, this sounds like a dreadful plug now, doesn't it? But in terms of the book as well, it's always nice to hear what people think about books. As you know, sometimes we're at risk of working in worlds which are kind of insular. It's occasionally, if people send us an email or whatever, oh, you know, I thought this was good, or oh, it's rubbish. You know, it's just nice to get feedback. So that's my kind of parting kind of thoughts.
I must admit, that's actually one of the reasons why I did really enjoy articles. Very much, And I think it was, and actually, I thought it was very dialogic. It actually really was an attempt to engage. Mainly, I thought your style and your approach really was an attempt to engage with them. I thought that was, but like you said, it's other than in a sort of very unpleasant academic sense, in the negative sense, it's very little, relatively little moving forward or positive engagement at times among academics. You don't often get that kind of, well, again, vast generalization, but it's not that obviously around very much.
Okay.
Okay, well, thanks very much.